We are fortunate to have so many great Herrmann scores, the Harryhausen films, The Day the Earth Stood Still.
What is your favorite Herrmann score?
Well, probably my favorite film score was his favorite film score, which is a movie also with George Sanders in a very similar, somewhat similar role, The Ghost of Mrs. Muir.
Yes.
Yes, many of you have seen that. And it's interesting, it was written in 1947. Herrmann was married to Lucille Fletcher, and then he fell in love with Lucille's cousin, Lucy, as he was scoring the story of Lucy Muir in The Ghost of Mrs. Muir. So that score is really Herrmann's passionate love music to the woman who would become his second wife, who was the cousin of his first. Are you still with me? And so it's a very passionate and a very beautiful score. And when he was invited to speak and show a film, he'd show that film, and sometimes people were surprised. They thought he'd bring Psycho or something. And he did show excerpts of those films and do some very eloquent speaking engagements. But really, The Ghost of Mrs. Muir, and it also debunks the notion of him as a crass individual, which, yes, he could be. He had a voice that sounded sort of like a Brooklyn taxi horn, and he said he had, cigarette butts going down his shirt and tie by lunchtime. But inside, he was this incredibly poetic, he was a romantic.
He was a romantic artist. I remember he and I think, I don't have count of the wives, but he and either wife number 2, I think, were very good friends with Marcia Hunt.
Yes.
And her husband.
Yes.
And then they lived close together there in the valley, and they socialized, and then all of a sudden he just disappeared. And Marcia talked to someone, and they said, that's Benny. He said, you'll hear from him when he decides to reconnect. And then several years later, he had another wife. He came back, and it was like, just picked up where they left off.
And he simply couldn't, I think he couldn't control it. There was something about him, as generous as he was as a friend, there was something where he thought if someone was out to do something to him, or just something chemically imbalanced happened, he would become very suspicious of someone and then disappear or pick a fight with them and storm away. But then years later, he made the attempt and he would often act as if nothing would happen. And you either made that choice to say, okay, nothing happened, we're best friends again, or you wouldn't. So very, very complicated person.
Real quickly before we go, I do want to draw Steve out a little bit, because he is a good friend. He's overly modest, but see, one of the things of the many things that Steve has done is back in the day, remember the show Biography with Peter Graves, and Steve produced a lot.
Remember when A&E wasn't a reality show network?
Exactly.
Documentaries?
Back in those days.
That's when I worked for it.
And of the many episodes that you produced, going back to the star of last night's picture, Richard Widmark. You did a documentary, Richard Widmark. As a matter of fact, one of the featured people in that was Eddie.
That's when I met Eddie?
That's right. So talk a little bit about the private Richard Widmark, because I think it's an interesting insight.
Perfect adjective. I will say that Widmark was a very private man, but he invited me into his home to talk initially about gene tyranny. I was doing a program on gene tyranny, and I realized, my God, we've got to do the Richard Widmark biography. And he said, absolutely, as long as I'm not in it. He wanted to just have a private life. He was living in Connecticut. His wife had Alzheimer's at the time, and I would say, by the way, the Widmark that you see in those early scenes at home with Barbara Bel Geddes and Panic in the Streets, that strikes me as the real Richard Widmark. He was a very soft-spoken man. He hated bullies. He was the absolute opposite of Tommy Udo in Kiss of Death. And he was just very kind. I mean, he was a little irritable at times, but he was a gentleman. And when I explained to him, I discovered that almost none of his co-stars was still alive at the time that I was doing this documentary. And I also learned this fascinating story that his brother, whom he adored, had suffered a head wound during World War II when he was escaping the Nazis, hiding, and then was in a German prison camp and died after the war, after many years in pain. And I said, if you're in the program, Mr. Widmark, you can tell us about John Ford, you can do this, and we can pay tribute to your brother. And I think that got him, and he was a wonderful on-camera interview, and one of his movies, You look on Amazon, that A&E biography accompanies one of his films on DVD, I think. But he was extremely gracious, and he would tell very funny stories, and very briefly, the one he told me about Panic in the Streets is the perfect complement to the one, to what was told last night about Jack Palance kicking poor Zero Mostel.
Yeah, goosing Zero Mostel.
Yes,
yeah,
Widmark recalled that, for those of you who saw the movie, when Widmark gets a good rap on the head from the revolver held by Mr. Palance, that on the first take, Palance did that with such energy that he actually knocked out Richard Widmark. So
Jack really got into his role.
He got into his roles. And similarly, the first time that Widmark worked with Sam Fulber, the director who was notorious for firing a gun sometimes to create tension on a set, after Fuller did that once, Widmark went up to him and said, in quiet, but very stern way, never do that again. I would love to have seen that. So he had great stories, and I remember the last time I saw him, he was in his probably mid to late 80s. He insisted on driving me to the train station to say goodbye.
Like a dad.
Like a dad, and he was just, and he was almost forgotten at that time, and I think he is still so underrated and so good, and I'm so glad you showed that film last night.
No, well, I'll tell you, it's been a long time since we were filming Fox Film Noir special segments in a bar in Silver Lake, but here we are.
Still available on DVD.
They're still available on DVD. Anyway, Steve, it's great to have you here.
Thank you,
Heart
Ron.
at Fire Center, Bernard Herrmann, Steve Smith, thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Steve.